Hello everyone and welcome to Open Elections Ukraine's first Google Hangout on air. Wais Bashir speaking to you from the Storyful head office in Dublin, Ireland. I'll be moderating this Hangout today, which will be discussing in the Ukraine. Statement by IPI, Stephen Ellis said, the degree to which pro-Russian separatists have detained and attacked journalists in Ukraine has been shocking, but the pattern of detentions by pro-government forces that we are now seeing is also alarming. These actions victimize not only journalists involved, but also the public, depriving people of what is happening in Ukraine. We urge authorities in Ukraine to direct pro-government forces to allow journalists to do their job without harassment or intimidation. And we urge authorities in Moscow to head of website. In his interview with Telekritika website, he said that journalist standards in the state of information war may be reconsidered. He said, I argue with my colleagues a lot, including the foreign ones, who says journalist standards should remain standards. It seems situational war should be security, unity of the country. If our basic standards in conflict with these two requirements, it is clear that we should reconsider these standards, of course, depending on each particular case. There are opinions that the government should take all information space into their hands and control. I'm against it. The state has never controlled this process here, including the question of information security intervene at this stage. I think it should be a matter of each media organization, each journalist, each editor, who should now take a significantly different angle to the information that appears in the media. This should be a process that is governed exclusively on the ground. We're also joined by Oksana Romaniuk, Executive Director of NGO Institute of Mass Information in Kyiv and representative of Reporters Without Ukraine. She's also a member of Stop Censorship movement of Ukrainian journalists. The Institute of Mass Information publishes monthly reports on the situation with press freedom in Ukraine. The last reports have been extremely worrying because of the threat to journalists' work in situation with censorship and biasness of the media. Yesterday, we commented on the situation with Vesti newspaper. She said, newspaper Vesti, which is distributed in Kiev, had clear anti-Maidan position. Yes, they had their own viewpoint. We can probably say that it is pro-Russian, but in Kiev, in the materials, they are trying to strike a balance. If we talk about regional publications of Vesti, for example, in Donetsk, completely different information is printed compared with the Kiev version. And in there, people have been told that power belongs to junta and the like. It seems to me that this is an asset-holding influence and guarantee of a safety cushion for those who fled with Yanukovych to Russia and would like to return to Ukraine in the future. So as mentioned, our topic is the role of media in Ukraine during the elections campaign. According to the report published by in Ukraine, 18 journalists have been kidnapped in east of Ukraine alone. There have been 22 incidents with journalists being beaten. Last week, journalist Usman Pashayev has been detained in Crimea. We hear about the incidents of pro-Russian forces interfering in the work of the Ukrainian media. My first question is, how can you describe the state of media in Ukraine at the moment? Can it be the gatekeeper, the scorekeeper, and a watchdog? I'd like to direct that question first of all I'd like to direct it to Stephen Ellis of IPI Free Media.
From what we've seen, the state of media freedom right now in Ukraine is somewhat troubling. There have definitely been advances since the fall of the previous regime in terms of some elements of information freedom, but at the same time, the level of violence, the level of detentions directed towards media representatives are very troubling. And as you mentioned earlier, it's our position that the interference with journalists' ability to do their jobs deprives not only journalists of their right to exercise press freedom, but the public of their right to know what is going on. Now, we're definitely troubled by reports of some media outlets allegedly fabricating news or running news reports that may veer closer towards propaganda. But our general position is that the antidote to that is more speech, not less.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for your thoughts on that. I'd also like to direct that question to Oksana Romaniuk. Hello, Oksana.
In Ukraine. First is, of course, physical security for journalists, because you said that 18 journalists were kidnapped, but by now we have figures that over 35 journalists were kidnapped in the east of Ukraine. Today, a journalist was heavily wounded into his head by separatists in the east of Ukraine. So physical security is really a very, very crucial issue today. The second point is informational war, which we are now seeing. We are now in this process. Actually, we are now realizing the importance of journalist standards, the responsibility of journalists. And as you said that maybe journalist standards should be revised, I think that there should not be revised. They should be just followed. There are some basic standards like truth, fair information, balance, reliability, and this is what is violated, and people are deceived, and it provokes aggression, the result of which we see immediately in real life. The third challenge is media reform. We are now in the process of building a new country. We have passed already 2 very important laws on access to information and on public broadcasting. Hello, do you hear me? Hello? 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 Nobody hears me. I think I have some troubles with internet.
Sorry, Oksana, you just...
Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sorry. If you could just repeat what you were saying. We just cut out for 30 seconds there.
I think I have some troubles with internet connection. So, okay, basically 3 main points. First is physical security. Second is informational war. And third is media reform. This is 3 main points for media environment in Ukraine today. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I'd like to follow up on that with the question to Yevhen. It has 3 points.
Yeah, I would agree with Stephen here. Evidently, there is an advancement in terms of media freedoms compared with what we used to have under the previous regime, but still this field is very unsecure, and there are a lot of challenges and even, I would say, dangers coming into the field of media. Speaking of standards, which was mentioned here, that I voiced the idea that media organizations here in Ukraine should come at an ad hoc basis towards covering these issues. I didn't mean that we should invent some other standards or change them. I would agree that we really need to follow what the traditional standards are, but we should also remember that Ukrainian media are working now under the conditions which Ukrainian journalists were never trained to work under. So we never were trained how to cover war. And now war happening in Ukraine, we've never been trained how to cover terrorism, and apparently a lot of terrorist activities are now taking place here. Ukrainian journalists never been trained how to talk about those who've been killed in the war and how to talk to their relatives, and that's quite a sensitive issue, and I see a lot of troubles on this end as well. Speaking of propaganda issue, I am here both as a director of J School and as one of the co-founders of stopfake.org website, which is debunking in propaganda, and I can say that we do not deal with a lot of Ukrainian propaganda. I would not say that there are plenty of it, probably 1/10 of all stories we run during the last 2 months were Ukraine-related propaganda. All the rest of the propaganda is coming from Russia, so I do not think that propaganda is really a big issue for Ukrainian media right now. There is a kind of uncertainty how to cover all this issue, and also the danger is that Ukrainian media are having many challenges at the same time, like war, upcoming elections, the aftermaths of Euromaidan, change of the government, and it's sometimes really very difficult to handle all this at the same time.
Well, some very interesting points there, and especially about conflict training. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be some people in the audience who would be interested in following up on your points about the lack of conflict training for a lot of Ukrainian journalists. So I'd like to go on to my second question. And on the 19th of May, journalists of Russian TV channel Life News were detained by Ukrainian authorities for providing assistance to separatists. For RT, Graham Phillips, has been arrested and was soon released. The issues has been discussed by the Committee to Protect Journalists. On May the 20th, International Press Institute called on all parties in Ukraine to release detained journalist safety in advance of presidential elections due to be held on May. The question is, how should these issues be regulated? Is it okay for the government to interfere with the work of foreign journalists if they see it as a threat to national security? Could you please comment on the situation with the journalist safety in Ukraine, and whose role is it to ensure that the normal work of the journalists remain during the elections? Now, I'd like to pose this question. Hello, Oksana.
Hello. I have some. Okay. Speaking about the Live News case, this case is quite ambiguous because, of course, if they are journalists who are working in Ukrainian territory and they should be released or let them be deported if they violated some legislation. But as far as I understand, they were arrested under some special conditions. They didn't have any journalist cards with them, and they were together with terrorists who were preparing to use anti-aircraft weapons. So they were arrested not like journalists. It appeared in process. They named themselves journalists. But I think that after their identities were established, they should have been released, and well, this is probably the position of Ukrainian media community. We certainly share. We do not want to turn into any totalitarian state, and we do not want to follow Russian way. That is why we are following this case very seriously in Ukraine, and we demand from our government either give us any proofs, any evidence that these people are guilty with terrorism, or just let them go.
Okay, some very interesting points there from Oksana. Thank you. And I'd like to pass this question on to hello, Yevhen.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I would agree with Oksana that evidently journalists covering the conflict should not be barred from conducting their duties, and that's very important for Ukraine that this conflict would be properly covered, so it would ensure the transparency of the situation, and government should not detain journalists. But here is the question of journalistic identity, if we really deal with a real journalist or just someone disguised as a journalist, which is usually can raise the questions if you are really a journalist or you are just, covered up paramilitary using the identity of the journalist. And in both cases, the identities of journalists are more than questionable, both in live news story and RT story, where they are kind of in a dubious roles, being there in the conflict zone. So that's a huge question, what else they've been doing besides conducting traditional journalistic activities. Because I don't know any other journalists rather than these two cases when the government interfered and prevented journalists from covering the conflict. More than that, I know exactly that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian media community welcome all foreign journalists, including Russian journalists, except those who've been, banned from entering Ukrainian territory for that or another reason. They've been welcomed to be there and to see everything by their own eyes and to make their own judgment. And nobody interfered in what type of coverage they provide for this. And this is quite unique when government gives a free hand to all media community to cover whatever they want, to be wherever they want. And nobody is regulating who is moving where and who is, shooting what. So I would describe the situation, kind of conditions for media working in this very conflict, very relaxed. And Ukraine receives a lot of positive coverage from Western media and even from some Russian liberal journalists, even we have very few of them placed here. And another big issue for me is if live news and Russia Today are really media outlets. Because I can greatly doubt it, and they are engaged in state-run, Kremlin-run propaganda campaign. They are part of state-run propaganda machine, and both Russia Today and Live News have been caught many, many times in twisting information, manipulated information, and being a channel for open propaganda against Ukrainian government, and Ukrainian people. So I'm not sure that journalists from these so-called media outlets should be trusted. And if the activities in the conflict zone are not compatible with those of activities of journalists, it seems to me they should be banned from being there and deported from outside of Ukraine. Speaking of stop fake research, so we greatly rely on Russia Today so-called news stories, and most of what we debunk on our website actually comes from both Russia Today and Live News, so I'm quite suspicious about their news gathering nature.
Some fascinating points by Yevhen Fedchenko. I'd just like to remind the audience that quotes will be pulled from and posted on Twitter from the @Storyful account, and also that will be recorded and archived for viewing later on. I'd like to get Stephen Ellis on this question as well. I'm sure you have some views. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
Well, with respect to the two Life News journalists who were detained, it's our position generally that it's not up to governments or other individuals to define necessarily who are journalists. We leave that up to media outlets themselves. If people are actually exercising a journalistic role, they are journalists. We've called for their release because based on the evidence we've seen, it's very inconclusive exactly what happened, what they're alleged to have done. The reports we've seen say that they were caught in the company of separatists, that they're alleged to be supporting terrorists, that there was a missile launcher or missile launchers with them when they were caught. But it depends, absent evidence clearly linking them to separatist activity or terrorist activity, and by that I mean actually inciting it or taking part in it, we continue to call for their release. Merely covering events as a journalist does not necessarily equate support for them, and it's inappropriate for governments to detain people who are merely reporting on events and link them to the actual actors there, unless, again, there is a clear link showing that they either incited violence or actively took part in it. It's our position that the government of Ukraine, and also, the government or the de facto authorities in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, should not be barring foreign journalists. Sorry, are you still there?
Sorry, Stephen, we just lost you there for... Now, sorry, we just lost you for the last seconds.
Okay. Basically, my main point is it's inappropriate for the government to be banning journalists or detaining journalists absent a clear connection linking them with either incitement to violence or actual commission of violence. If journalists are merely reporting on the activities of separatists or terrorists, they should be allowed to do their job.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, and I'd just like to remind everyone that there is a couple of minutes delay on this Hangout. I'd like to go on to the next question, which is posed to Yevhen. Yevhen, again, is the co-founder of Stop Fake organization, which debunks fake news stories from Russian TV. In one of changing journalistic standards, Phil Butler, in his article, be winning the information was at least on social media. As an expert on the digital journalism, what role do you think ground journalism should play in this conflict? In the current Ukraine-Russia war, is there a place for deliberative journalism?
Actually, this is a great question because I can say that probably this conflict would not be covered if we would not be covered properly if we would not have social media around, because traditional media are quite slow in providing information, and it even started not with a war in the east of Ukraine, even not in Crimea occupation, but it started even with Euromaidan, when digital media came in and basically takes the whole responsibility of covering and providing people with information, and television and other old legacy media were far behind in the pace of covering all this. But by saying that, I still would insist that there is a great place for traditional journalism because we had a lot of streamings from different campaigns and different events. We had a lot of opinions go around social media, but still we've been looking for the basic facts, and only those whom we call journalists could provide the fact-checking for that facts, and we can rely on them checking and monitoring information. And sometimes it really was very confusing to understand from social media what was happening around. And only when we saw the information coming from journalists, we could say that this is more like facts rather than the opinion, because these days everybody is trying to report on everything. And it's a lot of information, plenty of information. Much more probably than we used to have during coverage of any other conflict. But very often we don't know what to do with all this information, because it amounts, and in most cases we cannot verify if it's true, where the pictures or video has been taken, who did that, from whom the pictures come, what is the context of this, and it's the same what we have when we check the myths, and information for Stop Fake, because we have plenty of information coming from our users, because on the website we have a button which says report a fake, and we have a lot of incoming information from those who use our website, both in Ukraine and in Russia. By the way, the third of our audience is in Russia. So we receive a lot of tips what can be a fake information, and people are asking if we can do the fact checking and verification. And very often it's very difficult to say that just looking at the piece of the information, because we don't know if we can trust the source, under what conditions the information was received, and it takes a lot of time and efforts to check that.
Well, thank you, Yevhen. And once again, if you're interested in checking out the Stop Fake website, a link to it has been posted on the Hangouts page, as is a link to the Open Elections Ukraine, the community page, where members can post their witness accounts, and for the verification of media that has been posted will be on that community page as well. My next question is to Oksana. This concerns the event on May the 21st, when the Ukrainian prosecutor office blocked the bank accounts of newspaper Vesti, supposedly due to their connections to the Yanukovych family and their pro-Russian position. Now, we can notice that there are internal problems within the media. Are they objective? And who controls the media landscape? And who is the audience that they could trust? This goes to Oksana, the Vesti newspaper's supposed connections to the Yanukovych family and their pro-Russian position.
Well, I think that in the case of Vesti, this really was not planned. According to our sources, they were investigated into activities of into shady schemes of former Yanukovych entourage, and we think that if they really planned to close newspaper for its pro-Russian views, they would do that maybe a month ago, yes, but not when there is a couple of days before the election and there is basically no sense. We have really very big doubts concerning the financing scheme of Vesti, because there was no information at all about the owner. Vesti was distributed free of charge, very massively at roads, at subway stations. It was heavily invested into, and of course it gave a kind of propaganda in the interests of the owner, of the shady owner. So now this scheme is revealed, and we think that it is for us a basis to promote and to lobby the legislation on media ownership transparency. We should introduce transparency of media ownership at the market. Corrupted schemes should not be used in media business, and because it hampers not only, it influences not only the right of people to information, because people have a right to know whether they are manipulated or not, but it also hampers and endangers and just has a very bad influence upon the media market as it is, because they did not earn on advertising, but they were distributed free of charge, and it was a very big bad influence on the media market. So I would not regard that situation with the accounts of Vesti. I would not look into some motives like against or for those propaganda. Let's just remember that Kurchenko is a person who is against who sanctions were introduced in very many countries, and just this is the kind of sanctions from Ukraine which should have been introduced since long ago. This is the process of investigation. And speaking about reliability of information, yes, we live now in the world when there are very many sources of information, and people have very big problems with defining what is truth, what is fair information. In this situation, when we take, for instance, people in the east of Ukraine, they get absolutely different pictures from Russia, which says that there are fascists, there is terrible government, and they get a different picture from Kyiv, which says, okay, guys, we are preparing to presidential elections, we are introducing some reforms, and they just get quite embarrassed. In this situation, they have two reliable sources of information for them. First is social networks, where they have their own opinion leaders, where they communicate with their own circles, with their communities, and they can check information. And second source of information for them is local media, small local media outlets whose journalists are well known for them, who speak their own language. And interesting is we have recorded a very big number of attacks, namely on local media outlets in the eastern Ukraine. We have recorded some 20 attacks on local media offices when they were burnt down, journalists were threatened, some 10 journalists have had to leave their jobs, and they moved to Kyiv because of the threats. Some local towns, small towns in the east of Ukraine, they were left without local media outlets at all. So they just are deprived of sources, of this reliable source of information for them. This is very important, that this situation which we see now in Ukraine, the war is carried out at several levels. The informational level is probably one of the most important, really. So.
Thank you, Oksana, for your viewpoints. I'd like to go to Stephen, saying, especially with regards to the transparency of media ownership.
Well, I would generally agree with Oksana's point of view. Media ownership transparency is incredibly important. You need to be able to know that you can trust the source of media, the source of the news that's coming to you. And I would also add to her point that it's especially important when there is corruption involved, but it's also important even in cases where media ownership is not involved in any sort of corruption or any untoward activities. When you have cross-ownership of individuals or groups who own both media and other economic interests, it makes them vulnerable perhaps to government pressure, but also to economic pressure. And we've seen, unfortunately, in Ukraine, actually in previous years, and also in a number of other countries around the world, we see self-censorship by journalists who are afraid of criticizing other economic interests of media owners for fear of losing their job. We see government becoming more entangled sometimes with media ownership in terms of media owners needing government favor to be able to survive economically. So that makes them vulnerable to censorship, albeit indirect, by the government as well.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And Yevhen, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with my colleagues and probably would quote here my mentor, Geneva Verhoeven, who used to be director of Annenberg School for Communication in Los Angeles, who said that there can be no objectivity of media, but what we can look is transparency of ownership of the media, because when we know from where the news come, we can then look into the nature of this news and realize what the context of the news, from where they come, who is producing them, and so the transparency here is really very important, and that's what should be still done in Ukraine, because in many cases we really only can guess about who owns media here, and partially the problem was that media never been the business itself, so they've been owned just for the as a side business, just for the sake of having political influence and having the stake in political and economic process, rather than just producing qualitative content to sell it on the market. So this situation should really be changed, and people here are really interested in news, and the importance of news is increasing because that's what people are doing basically every morning, and sometimes even during night they are checking Twitter for what happened during last 2, 4, 6 hours, and those news are commodity now, and media organizations should deliver that, and that opens the new horizons for news media organizations, so they become relevant again. People are relying on them and getting information, so here is a huge perspective for their news market. So if someone would decide to invest in Ukrainian media market just as a only media-related investments, that would be really the new era for development of media, because before that nobody was serious about owning media, and you would basically found no any important Western media organization owing anything here in Ukraine, because it was a very closed market, very politically oriented, and many media outlets were created just for the upcoming elections and have been dying just when results been pronounced. So I think this period is over, and now it's kind of a new perspective both for journalists and editors and owners, and we should use these rising opportunities to create the new media market here.
Well, thank you for your thoughts. I'd like to, and the question is, what steps should be taken by the newly elected president to ensure the freedom of speech in Ukraine and the normal functioning of the media system? I would like to...
Hello?
Hello, Oksana?
Hello? Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes. Well, I could pose that question to you. Did you hear the question?
Can you repeat it, because I had some good troubles with connection. Hello?
Hi, Oksana.
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, what steps should the newly elected president take to ensure freedom of speech in Ukraine and the normal functioning of the media industry?
Well, this, I think, is a question to political will, of course, because we have seen a lot that many things depends on really the political will to carry out really reforms, to observe freedom of speech, and what should be done in Ukraine. We have passed the law on public broadcasting, so I think that the government should just focus on speaking about the media reforms. They should really introduce this public broadcasting in Ukraine. They, of course, the main steps will be done by media community, but all technical procedures should be in place. Ukraine really needs its own BBC, as we said. And I do hope that next year we will see a really independent and reliable source of information, the journalists of which will not be dependent or will not be afraid neither of pressure from any political parties, from government, but they will be they will follow journalist standards, and this public broadcasting will be ruled by an independent supervisory board. What next we need? We need also this transparency of media ownership. We need also to carry out privatization of state-owned media. We have such an obsolete structure in Ukraine, which remained since Soviet times. We have a network of state-owned local media which are really not profitable and which can be hardly called journalism, because they are like leaflets which report only about the activities of local governments. This is not journalism. It should be reformed, and these people should get opportunity to earn like to do a job as journalists and to earn money as journalists. What else? I think that another step, well, we have some minor ideas like changes to different laws to make better conditions for journalists to work. And there is also another big sphere where the government can show its will to defend freedom of speech. This is impunity. We have now over 300 journalists who were injured, beaten during the revolution and during the last year. All these cases should be properly investigated and aggressors should be punished, because impunity is the basis for further and other violations of freedom of media. So we had this problem with Yanukovych when only every 20 journalist could expect that his or her aggressor would be punished or fined for breaking a nose to journalists, really. So this was really a problem in Ukraine, and I do hope that we will be able to overcome this problem with impunity. And all the other questions, I think that government just should be transparent and should not interfere into media. So just be transparent, be open to questions, and that's all.
Well, thank you, Oksana. I'd like to pass that question on to Stephen. What steps should be taken by the newly elected president?
I would agree with the recommendations that Oksana made, especially with respect to impunity and moving forward with plans to create a public broadcaster. To that, I would add, make sure to crack down on corruption, ensure that journalists and the public have access to government information. I know that in recent years, Ukraine introduced a actually fairly forward-thinking law, but there were always questions about the implementation of that. So the government needs to ensure access to information, make sure that there are strong guarantees of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, support journalists in terms of improving standards. The government shouldn't be mandating journalist standards, but to the extent that journalists take it upon themselves to improve their own standards and the standards of their colleagues, the government should generally be supportive of that effort. And then finally, in terms of any sort of state revenues that go into advertising in media markets, that sometimes distorts the market. So at the very least, the government needs to be extremely transparent with where that money is coming from, where it's going to, and what process is used to award it.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for your viewpoints, and I'd like to pass that question on to Yevhen.
Yeah, I would agree with everything which was said by my colleagues, and one of the most important things is to investigate and punish all those who've been involved in beating and persecuting of journalists during Euromaidan and afterwards. And then the upcoming president should evidently give up his own ownership in the media company, or TV company he owns. The state-owned media ownership should be abandoned at all levels, from the national to the local markets. and to make much more emphasis on the development of public television and radio, as it was said. Also, what we need is to guarantee the protection of internet and to make sure that no future government would be able to regulate our activities in social media, to lawlessly monitor it and use information from there for their own ends, And also there is a homework which journalism community should do itself. I think we should really reevaluate our activities during Yanukovych years and probably look into Yanukovych leaks and to look into activities of journalists and media organizations who've been covertly paid by the government then to promote their ideas. And I know there are some documents being found by my colleague for investigative journalism who found in Yanukovych leaks some evidences that Ukrainian journalists and editors have been paid for promoting government ideas, and I think that's absolutely unacceptable, and journalistic community should absolutely say no to any further activities like that in the future.
Well, thank you very much for your viewpoints. As mentioned, we're going to pull in some questions from the audience. We're receiving questions on Twitter and on the actual Hangout page. One question that comes from Leonard Ragozin, which came via Twitter, was that Lenta.ru was purged on Kremlin orders because of Ilya Azar's reporting of Ukrainian revolution. Now he's being kicked out of Ukraine. So that's more of a statement, but does anyone have any thoughts on that? And I would like to pass that on.
Exactly? How's his name? Lenta.ru and the journalist name? Who
Ilya
was
Azar.
Ilya Azar, Ilya Varlamov. Yes, we heard about that. Well, it's really a pity, and we will investigate it on that situation, and we will try to help him arrive in Ukraine. We will address the government. I'm not sure that he was banned entry as a journalist, but maybe he just fell into that category of young men, suspicious looking, because if you pass frontier point, you give your passport, but not journalist card. Maybe he was. So we will investigate into that, and of course we know Ilya Varlamov. Well, we need actually more good Russian reporters who can provide alternative information for Russian audience about Ukraine.
Oh, thank you, Oksana.
If I can add that,
sure.
As I mentioned, the government should not be, say to journalists how they should cover the situation. But the case is that the border service, which is usually preventing journalists from, Russian journalists mainly, from entering Ukraine, they are not, reading news or watching news. So they are just following the instructions, general instructions about Russian citizens
Yes, exactly.
on border crossing, and they cannot do the selective picking up of people. So if that or another journalist falls under the general category who should be looked into and probably banned from entering Ukraine, that's the border service what is basically doing, and they cannot do editorial judgment on the quality of the content. But on the other hand, we should again stress the importance of journalists sticking to the role of journalists, even if they are covering such a controversial issue as a war unfolding in Ukraine right now. But I would disagree with Steve, who said that even if we would imagine that RPG was found in the trunk of their car, they are still journalists. I don't think that if journalists carry weapons or help terrorists to carry weapons, they still can be considered journalists. So they perform some other activities, and we cannot imagine United States tolerating journalists who are contributing to Al-Qaeda efforts, for example, and carry weaponry for them, or Israel being sympathetic to foreign journalists who help terrorists or any other government would not tolerate journalists from other countries contributing to the weapon supply chains of those who are who've been suspected in terrorist activities.
Well, thank you, Yevhen. Stephen, I'm sure you have a comment on that.
Yeah, and I would like to just clarify. I agree with Yevhen. It's completely inappropriate for journalists to be carrying weapons, to involve themselves in the arms trade, to be supplying weapons. My point earlier was only that it's unclear whether or not the missile launcher was theirs. If it is linked to them, that is incredibly problematic, and we would have serious problems with that. But unless it can be specifically shown that it is theirs, that it was not necessarily someone else's, that they're aware that it was there, unless we have answers specifically to those questions, we prefer not to jump to conclusions.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And yes, investigations into the arrest of the reporters from our audience. This one is coming from Anya Radzievich. She asks, does the Gongadze case still influence self-positioned journalists that in particular manifests in self-censorship? This is referring to the Gongadze case, and I would like to pass that question. Oksana, if you would like to jump in on that.
Gongadze has turned into a real symbol for Ukrainian journalists. Really, it is our symbol of freedom of speech, and every year very many journalists gather in the center of Ukraine, and for us, Gongadze is the symbol of our fight against impunity. And his example, of course, influences media community, and the fact that the instigators of his murder have not been established as yet, it is also has very big importance for us. Well, yes, it has its influence. It's a very symbolic figure for Ukraine.
Well, I'd like to pass that on to Yevhen, if you have any views on that.
Yeah, I've been working for many years with Gia Gongadze, and I knew him very well, and I can support the idea that he is an iconic figure for a young generation of journalists whom we teach here in J School, and he left a huge legacy, and I'm sure that he greatly contributed to the coverage journalists have been doing during Euromaidan, and they're doing now, and he created Ukrainian Pravda as the very first internet independent media outlet, and it also has its own marking on the media history of Ukraine. So on the other hand, his figure is a kind of a reminding, because the case was never properly investigated. I mean, not on the level of those who executed it, but on the level who ordered the killing and beheading of the journalist. And we've never heard any reference to those people high in the government who evidently might be behind the case. So we only been told the names of those who executed him, and that should be kind of reminding that it should never happen again in Ukraine, and journalists should unite to protect themselves against any further influences from the government, from the law enforcers. I would remind that the law enforcers have been those who killed Gia Gongadze for the only purpose to stop his journalistic activity. So it's a huge reminder, and it's still here, and as I mentioned, the case is not fully resolved.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, and unfortunately we don't have time to ask from the audience, and I'd like to thank everyone who has asked a question on Twitter. This question comes from Maria Zhadanova. She's asking Stephen in particular, in terms of the organization assist in this question, or should this be a role primarily played by the Ukrainian government? And that goes to Stephen Ellis of IPI Free Media.
I'm very sorry. Unfortunately, you cut out just a little bit from my connection. Could you please repeat the question?
Hello, Stephen.
Hello. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear the question. Could you please repeat it?
This question comes from Maria Zhadanova. She's asking if, in terms of the situation with threats to journalists, international organization assist in this question, or should this be the role primarily?
As far as I understand the question, you're asking whether there's a role for international organizations in addressing threats to journalists, or if it's primarily the government's responsibility. Ultimately, it is.
Yes.
It is the government's responsibility, because they do need to take steps to protect journalists that are threatened and to hold to account individuals that make those threats. The impunity for threats or violence against journalists is a serious scourge, not only in Ukraine but around the world. But international organizations also do play a key role in terms of making people aware of that, not only the threats themselves, but holding government to account on their responsibility to actually investigate threats or violence against journalists. It's our job to give voice to people and to put pressure on governments when they don't step up and do what they're supposed to do.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I'd like to also pass the question on to Oksana. And Oksana?
Can you please just repeat, because I had very bad connection just the last minute.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. Yes, there are people dropping in and out of this connection. Oksana, I asked, in terms of the situation with threats to journalists, can an international organization assist in this question, or should this role be
Can Russian, sorry?
Sorry, no. In terms of the situation with threats to journalists, can an international organization assist in this question, or should this role be played by the Ukrainian government?
I think that we really need assistance from international organizations, because we are now in the conditions where legislation doesn't work, especially in the east of Ukraine, or take Crimea, for instance, and journalists, 80% of journalists' rights are violated, namely in hotspots, where the journalists can be protected only either on their personal level, I mean when you put armored vest on yourself and you wear a casque, or through diplomatic levels, through international pressure, when international organizations make their statements, and these statements put pressure, they form like public opinion, and politicians of different countries have to make decisions and have to free journalists have to accept this or that way of behavior. And for us, it is very important that, for instance, many international organizations interfered and gave their assessments during the Ukrainian Revolution times, during this times of occupation and aggression, which we see now in Ukraine. For us, international organizations, their opinion is a kind of criteria, you know, because they are like a third party, which can give an unbiased view. And in these conditions, it is very important that international organizations do not make conclusions, only surface conclusions, but they should dig into the situation, they should investigate into that, and they should make reliable and trustworthy conclusions, because their conclusions are really very influential. For us, it is very important that international community continues following the situation in Ukraine and applying all range of its instruments of influence upon the situation.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you, Stephen, for your views, and thank you to Yevhen Fedchenko as well. We're still receiving questions on the Q&A page. I apologize if your questions weren't asked. I'd like to remind the viewers that Elections Ukraine page, which the link will be posted very shortly, and also be posted on Twitter account as well. I would like to thank Oksana, Yevhen, and Stephen for being our distinguished on today's Hangouts, and I would like to remind the audience that more is going to be planned in the future every Friday. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.